I'm going to introduce Sarah. Sarah Songhorian is an assistant professor in moral philosophy at the Faculty of Philosophy of Vita-Salute San Raffaele University and deputy head of study program and the Master of Philosophy, Politics and Public Affairs at the University of Milan and Vita-Salute San Raffaele University. She's a member of the board of the Società Italiana di Neuroetica e Filosofia, delle neuroscienze. Forgive my pronunciation. And she works in moral philosophy with particular attention to empathy, the interplay between emotions and reason, moral psychology, and moral cognition. I look forward to her talk on the problems of empathy, which is very important for me for personal reasons. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen, so just give me 1 second. So thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Alvaro, for inviting me. I had a blast with the first two talks, so some of the things that I'm going to talk about are related, very much related to them, so I'm very happy about it. And I guess we all have the same reviewers. I don't know who said that, but of course, the definition of empathy comes up a lot, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And we have the same reviewers and probably the same quotation in mind, so I wanted to start as well with the quotation that has been mentioned a few times already, so I'm not going to do that. So my goal today is to talk a little bit about the problems of empathy. I'm going to try and do that by still keeping in mind that it has a lot of bright sides and good things, but I think focusing on the issues or problems is useful to get a better sense of what we want to keep and what probably has to be kind of balanced or checked. So I'm gonna start by a very general introduction that is gonna take, I hope, not a lot of time, and then focus on two main problems, which are burnout and loss of self, as they are sometimes discussed in the philosophical literature, and partiality as a broad issue with empathy. And I'm gonna try and see whether there's a solution there to some of these issues. Okay, so if we get to the general understanding of empathy, which is not necessarily evidence based or concept analysis based, we have, generally speaking, this sense of empathy as being the one and only thing that will help us in pretty much any interpersonal issue. So I'm going to focus, of course, on interpersonal empathy and not on aesthetics and other issues here. And one of the things that is believed to help with, and it definitely helps, but it's not the only thing that will lead us to, I think, understand, care, and act in favor of others. And of course, I come from moral philosophy, so what I'm mostly interested in is the role of empathy in leading us to what we can conceive of as morally appropriate behavior. So again, as I mentioned, I do believe that empathy fosters and supports many of the good things that we have, like care, compassion, attention to others, and cooperation, of course. But we need to be aware, I think, of its dark side, and and that is something that we can do by, I guess, having a better sense of the concepts involved and the definitions we want to work on when talking about empathy. So there is a very strong sense in which it is because we are and can be empathic that even in daily life, and not considering here specific conditions, but in general, that we can have forms of emotional exploitation or emotional vampirism, even sadism, and of course, the extent to which these are problematic depends on the context and the actual thing we kind of aim. But even, I don't know, if I have a friend and I know she is kind of keen to guilt, I can exploit that for deciding which movie to watch together, or of course for many other things. So there's a sense in which to have these that we understand as negative things, we still need to have a sense of what the others are feeling. So a sense of empathy in a way is still involved. So what I wanted to do today is precisely trying to test whether we can have a concept of empathy that will allow us to see the dark side and possibly remedy it. And of course, in healthcare context, it is crucial. Empathy is crucial and has been often described as a building block of those soft skills that are needed to deal with patients and to have a good communication and a good relationship. Because otherwise, of course, if you take away that, you will have, and there's a bunch of evidence for this, patients' dissatisfaction, but also poor treatment compliance and clinical outcomes. So it is definitely true that empathy is relevant, and the idea of the cold and detached clinician is not a very good one to have. But we, I guess, need to be very careful when we talk about empathy and empathy's positive sides, not to kind of misregard the possible problems, not just of being too empathic, but of being empathic in general. Okay, so I'm getting to the definitions and related concepts. In the philosophical literature, as in all the literatures on empathy, there's a very, very different, many different definitions, and it is kind of complicated to get a grip of all of them. But what I'm worried about mostly are broader definitions. So definitions that will basically include within the very concept of empathy many things that I think are related to it, but I don't feel are identical to. So we have, of course, compassion, sympathy, care, but even pro-social behavior sometimes gets into the very definition and helping behavior. And I'm not sure, actually, I don't think it's a good way to go. And some of the instruments we have to evaluate empathy are very broad. And it makes sense, of course, to have broad ways to evaluate empathy, but I think that they tend to, again, oversimplify what we have, and then they don't really allow us to see the kind of problems or issues that empathy has. So if you get helping, altruistic, and cooperation, everything in the definition of empathy, then you basically have a very hard time explaining why sometimes people can be empathic but can be unhelpful to others, or even, mildly sadistic or whatever. So I'd rather distinguish empathy from sympathy and perspective taking, but even from the behavioral outputs that it might enable. So I think that it is true that empathy fosters all of the things that you see there in brackets, but I don't think it's a straightforward kind of connection. So that is my worry here. And of course, as was already mentioned, there's a lot of work distinguishing between affective and cognitive empathy, and it's a very good distinction in a way. But of course, these two things are very much related, and I guess having a minimal sense of what empathy is, at least for me, conceptually, is a better way to start thinking about these issues. So when I think of a minimal sense, I'm thinking about something that relates to basically the affective component of it and not so much the cognitive one. I would refer to it more in terms of perspective taking and sympathy. And here the idea is basically that of emotional attunement. So the idea that what we have in empathy is the ability to feel something that is to some extent congruent and not of course identical to the emotional state of someone else. Being able to vicariously merge with another feelings. And of course, we're going to go back to the distinction between self and other. But in this minimal sense, we can get a sense of how very young children can have an empathic response, although they, of course, might not have higher cognitive abilities to understand others and perspective taking, basically. So if we understood it this way, without putting, helping, generous, altruistic behavior inside of the concept of empathy, I think we get a definition and an idea of it that is morally neutral. Again, of course, I'm interested in morality. So, and why it is relevant for me to have it as a neutral psychological mechanism? Well, precisely because this way you can have a sense of emotional attunement that is then the basis for both developing into a sympathetic and compassionate individual, as well as someone that would definitely exploit others' emotions because they can kind of get a grip of them. So I do think that for many reasons, emotional attunement is the fastest and very likely developmentally the first way we have of understanding and interacting with others, but I don't think it's the only way possible. Some of the reasons have been already mentioned, actually. Okay. And I know that, I mean, today with you, I feel like it is clear that there are many things that can be understood with empathy, but unfortunately, there are many debates in which empathy is still taken to be very broad and very kind of all-encompassing concept. So I have two in mind. One is sometimes the debate on moral bioenhancement, but also in the ethics of care, there are several authors that are still kind of having this very broad concept of empathy, pretty much doing all the work, getting us to behaving in a morally good way, and that enters the very possibility of accounting for, manipulative or sadistic behavior, just to give you an example, but in general, to account for empathy's dark side. Okay, now burnout and loss of self, which I think is one of the risks of a broad sense of empathy, and a sense of empathy that will immediately and straightforwardly link it to morally good behavior, right? So why is it the case that we risk burnout and loss of self? Well, it might be a kind of dystopian scenario, but I don't think it's so unrealistic in fact. Well, if we have as the one and only thing that is morally relevant, sorry, that we have to focus our attention on others' needs, then of course we have a theory that is extremely demanding to individuals because they always have to have others as targets of their actions on the one end, but on the other, we won't be able to recognize that we have, as individuals, duties or rights that we can act for. So if empathy is the only moral disposition, the only thing leading us to be good people, then it makes sense to be as empathic as we possibly can, just to be moral. I think that is something that we usually attribute to saints, but we don't expect everyone to behave that way each and every time. And just to give you a very stupid example, if you wish, if that were the case, so if empathy was the only thing morally good, then there is no way a doctor should leave their practice if people will still be requiring her help, right? Why a doctor can leave the OR if people need surgeries. And we're gonna come back to this. So to put it very bluntly, I do think that empathy is necessary or at least very useful, but I don't think it's sufficient. So we need something else to kind of have a good balance in terms of here in terms of self-other, of course, but more generally, as we will see with partiality as well, to balance what we can actually accept as parochial behavior and what we can't. So we need a criterion, so to speak. So the risk of these kind of understanding of empathy is, I guess, similar to what the ethics of care has. And here I have a quote by Gilligan, and she says that the potential error in case reasoning lies in the tendency to forget that one has, sorry, you are up there, has terms. I didn't remember sorry. And so creating a tendency to enter into another's perspective and to see oneself as selfless. So that is the selflessness that I'm kind of talking about or that I'm worried about. And I think that we need a balance there just as much as the ethics of care needs it. Okay. And so these at best can lead to burnout and moral distress, which are two very relevant problems that we have and we recognize now in many domains, but especially, of course, in clinical settings. And to feel overwhelmed without the very possibility to set boundaries. And at worst, it could lead to forgetting about oneself or becoming selfless. This is, again, something that the ethics of care and feminist philosophy have discussed for a while now. Okay, so if we get to this selflessness in particular, it's interesting because in a way, if you think of precursors of empathy, so moral identification as a kind of preliminary ability that we can have and can see as a condition for empathy. In newborns, for instance, they definitely don't have a self-other distinction in the terms that we understand it. And it makes sense, of course, that they don't, but it's much more problematic if we think of adults getting back to that kind of state of selflessness. And weirdly enough, the detachment that is characteristic of, the idea of the clinician without empathy is actually also one of the results of burnout itself. So it's kind of paradoxical that it has these two faces. Sorry, just a side note in a way. So of course, burnout and selflessness are empirical issues, are problems that are empirical, but they're also theoretical because of what I've just said, right? In the case of our OR doctor, the problem there is that we don't have, if we focus only on these broad sense and straightforward sense of empathy, we don't have a criterion to assess when she can basically leave. And she might have, of course, explanatory reasons. She can have some commitment elsewhere, or she might be tired and she decides to leave her practice. But those explanatory reasons without a criterion are not necessarily justifying. So maybe she doesn't have a justification for what she's doing. And I'm going to mention again this difference between explanation and justification because it's, I think, philosophically is of course very relevant, but I think it's important when we get to these issues of empathy, basically. Okay, partiality. This is in a way much more discussed in the philosophical literature and in empirical one as well. So basically, of course, humans, as many other species, are partial. And so partiality modulates empathy in the sense that we do empathize better and more easily with those that are similar and closer to us, both physically or emotionally. That is a natural tendency with very good evolutionary reasons, of course. But the question is, again, how can we take that into account, right? So if, again, we have a sense of empathy that is very broad and very straightforwardly leading to moral behavior, then either we say that it's not true that we are partial, and so that we have to refute the evidence showing this, or we have to put forth an argument claiming that these biased responses are appropriate from a normative standpoint. So, since I don't believe that that is neither of these are good ways to go, I think on this, at least, the burden of proof lies with those that are actually trying to push for a very broad sense of empathy. But I don't see an alternative for them here. Whereas I do take these preferential attitudes to be there and to modulate empathy the way we feel, right? And that is to me kind of problematic, not necessarily because of how we feel, but if and when that feeling leads us to behave in ways that are discriminatory or that make us prefer those that are the nearest and dearest just because of that. And there are many ways and many times in which it is okay to prefer our loved ones, of course, but there might be situations in which we don't have a justification, a moral justification for that to happen. And here is just an example of the many things that modulate empathy and makes us a little bit unreasonable, I guess, and is just the identifiable victim effect. I'm sure you all know it, but I think it's interesting because of, again, the distinction between explanation and justification, right? So we do have evidence showing that when we have a picture or a story of an identifiable victim, we tend to donate much more to charities, as opposed to when we just know the numbers, the statistical victim. What is always puzzling to me is the way we are unreasonable in the sense that when you put the story of someone and then you add the statistics, so I guess the reasonable thing to do would be to kind of have empathy activated because of the identifiable victim, and then recognizing that there's many more individuals that have that same issue. I would think that it would be reasonable for us to donate more, but we don't. So there are many things that we can explain in terms of these, these biases or these partial effects that are explained but not justified necessarily. But just an example. There are, of course, many more. Okay, so again, if we understand empathy as an amoral ability, so not necessarily having leading us to a good moral behavior or being a good moral individual, then we can account, I think, for both the kind of moral route and the immoral one, and accounting for biases and errors and mistakes. And so I do tend to think that empathy itself can be biased or modulated by factors that are not morally relevant. And at least sometimes it can lead us to unjustified preferences and partiality. So again, what we can have here is, if you wish, an argument against the sufficiency of empathy for moral behavior, and the idea that we need several other abilities like a sense of fairness or impartiality to kind of compensate for these possible biases being there. Okay, so now getting to an attempt of trying to keep the good and get rid or at least control the bad sides. Of course, there's a question there whether we should stop talking about empathy altogether, and Professor Markova mentioned this already, or we can conceive a positive role. Of course, the spoiler is I do think there's a positive role for empathy. And I think that it might have to do with trying to educate and regulate empathy, basically. Sorry, I keep. Okay, so if that is the case, we can think of it as an enabling condition for developing that kind of, properly moral character of it, and so sympathy, if you wish. And I come from a kind of a Smithian background in philosophy, And so I will try and read it in those terms. So, well, empathy is just a psychological amoral mechanism that can lead us in both directions. I do believe that once we get to sympathy or regulated empathy, those are less likely to happen. So basically, you need to be empathic to be mildly sadistic or manipulative. You cannot be manipulative if you are sympathetic or if regulated empathy, so to speak, because the perspective you're actually kind of getting to is that of a spectator with a normative standpoint. So you have already kind of you get to a kind of moral standpoint to begin with. So Darwell pointed out that sympathy is felt from the perspective of one caring. And I think that that means that you kind of exclude some of the dark sides of the mechanism in its, kind of minimal sense. And I'm Smithian in the sense that I think it's when we are capable of kind of reflecting upon actions and attitudes that we actually can be motivated by moral reasoning. And it's that point, that level, when we develop a moral conscience. Smith talks about the impartial spectator as a figure of conscience and reason, that we are capable of assessing whether motivations are genuinely moral. And of course, there are many times in which we might do a good action with bad or amoral intentions, and might do something generous in front of you just because I want to look good. And that's okay in a way, but it's not the best example of moral agency. I should be doing a good thing because I think it's the right thing to do, not because I want to look good in front of you, babe. But these two elements have to be kind of conjoined to have a properly moral action. And so in Smithian and Humean terms, there's actually, interestingly, they already foresee the issues that closeness has or can have. And so they talk about a standpoint that is, for Smith, that of an impartial and well-informed spectator that is emotionally engaged, but that can counteract the impulses of self-love and is able to regulate our selfish and original passions, and sympathy itself is what Kauppinen calls the ideal regulated empathy, basically. And again, in Smithian terms, without such a regulatory mechanism, others' interests can never be put into balance with our own. And basically is claiming that we will always prefer ourselves on others. So to get to the end point, I guess, I think that there's some research showing that emotions can, of course, be educated by reason, and I'm here thinking of it in terms of a should as well. So I think that they can and should be educated by reason. And that is because with these more impartial factor, I think we can correct some of the parochial responses that we kind of see we have. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we will change the way we feel about it, at the first level, so to speak, but that we can get to a point where we evaluate that reaction and we kind of distance ourselves from that. And interestingly, there is, of course, evidence of the difference of basic activations of empathy and reported recognition of pain in others. So there is, I mean, what I'm talking about here is not, I hope, is not too demanding, because we do that a lot and we do that all the time. It's just something that we probably have to kind of educate a little bit more. And it's something that we usually do when we talk about emotions in general. We think of emotions as neither negative nor positive by themselves, and we kind of push for regulation and education as the thing that we have to do. So I don't think it's a kind of a weird idea, but it's something that is not always explained or always accounted for in at least in the philosophical debates that I'm mostly aware of. So these can lead us to have it stronger when to correct it when it's too strong, or to increase it when it's too weak. So so what I've tried to do is I've tried to provide what is, of course, a working definition. It's not going to solve anything, but just trying to talk with you about it in these terms and distinguishing it from related concepts. And I've shown at least 3 cases of dark sides that I think are interesting. And I've basically tried to avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater by focusing on regulation and education to keep empathy's good sides. So thank you very much.